I'll never forget that night. But before I take you there, I think it's only fair to explain how everything in my life looked before it all began to crumble. Because from the outside, we seemed fine. More than fine, actually. We seemed like the couple everyone thought had figured it out. Like we were the example other people pointed to when they wanted proof that love could last. My name's David. Though most of my friends just call me Dave, I was 34 years old when all of this happened. Living in a mid-sized town in Ohio, about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, I worked as an IT project manager for a regional healthcare company. Nothing flashy, but stable enough that I could afford a modest 3-bedroom home and still have money left over for weekend trips, date nights, and saving for the future. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. And then there was Emily. She was 29 at the time. If you'd met her, you'd probably understand how easy it was for me to fall for her. She had this warm, magnetic smile that made strangers feel like old friends. And she carried herself with a kind of effortless charm. She was the type of person who could walk into a crowded room and, within 10 minutes, be in the middle of a conversation with half the people there. I always envied that about her. Because I've always been more of the quiet observer type, Emily worked as a marketing coordinator for a local nonprofit. She loved what she did, and honestly, that passion was part of what drew me to her. When we first started dating back in 2015, I was struck by how much she cared not just about her job, but about the people she worked with. About causes, about the idea of making some small difference in the world. We'd met through a mutual friend at a barbecue. And though I wasn't really looking for anything serious at the time, something about her laugh, loud, unself-conscious. Riel pulled me in. Our relationship grew fast. We moved in together after just a year, partly because it felt right, and partly because her apartment lease was ending, and my house had more space. By 2018, I proposed her on a trip to New York City, right in Central Park near Bethesda Terrace, where a street performer was playing Yellow by Coldplay on an acoustic guitar. I know it sounds cliché, but it was one of those moments that felt almost scripted, like the universe was setting the stage for us. We got married the following year in a small ceremony. Just close family and friends, nothing too extravagant. My dad gave a toast that left everyone in tears, and I remember thinking as I looked at Emily across the table during dinner that I was the luckiest man alive. For the next couple of years, life felt steady. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but nothing earth-shattering. We'd go on hikes together. Binge-watch shows on Netflix. 2019 was the year we devoured Stranger Things. Season 3 in one weekend. And we talked about starting a family. Emily wasn't quite ready, though, and I respected that. She wanted to be more settled in her career, maybe even move up in her organization before taking that step. I told myself we had time, but if I'm being honest, looking back, I can see the cracks that were already forming. They weren't obvious, not at first. Just small things. The way Emily seemed more tired than usual some nights. Or how she started keeping her phone face down on the counter when she used to leave it wherever. She explained it away easily enough: longer work hours, needing space from screens, that kind of thing. And I believed her, because why wouldn't I? Trust had always been the foundation of what we built together. I remember in early 2021, not long after the pandemic restrictions began easing, she started going out more often with her friends. At first, I encouraged it. After all the isolation we'd been through, it made sense to reconnect. She'd say things like, "I'm grabbing dinner with Sarah," or "I'm going to a trivia night with Lisa." I never questioned it because I knew Sarah and Lisa, and I knew how much Emily valued her friendships. But slowly, those nights out became more frequent. And then, sometimes she wouldn't name who she was going with. She'd just say, "I'm heading out with the girls," or "Don't wait up." Again, I told myself it was fine. She deserved her independence. I wasn't the jealous type. Still, I couldn't shake this faint unease that would creep in when I lay awake in bed, scrolling through my phone, waiting for her to come home. It wasn't like her to be vague. Emily had always been open, sometimes to a fault. She'd tell me stories about her coworkers in excruciating detail, or rant about something she'd seen on Twitter like it was a national crisis. Vagueness wasn't her style. One night, I brushed it off as stress on my part. I told myself I was overthinking, that I needed to trust the woman I married. But that little voice in the back of my head kept whispering, what if? In the summer of 2022, things escalated. Emily told me she was going to spend the weekend at her mom's place. Her mom lived about 40 minutes away, in a small town where Emily grew up. It wasn't unusual for her to visit. They were close, and I'd often encouraged her to go when she needed a break. So I didn't think twice when she packed an overnight bag and kissed me goodbye that Saturday morning. That evening, I decided to grab dinner alone at a local bar and grill. It was one of those humid Midwestern nights, the kind where the air feels heavy. You can smell the faint temps of rain, even though the forecast said clear skies. After eating, I took the long way home, cutting through some back roads near the edge of town, and that's when I saw it. Her car, parked outside, an apartment complex I'd driven past dozens of times before. At first I thought it couldn't be hers. It had to be a coincidence. But then I slowed down, and there was no denying it. The same little dent near the back bumper from when she'd backed into a shopping cart. The same support local coffee bumper sticker she'd bought at a festival last year. It was her car, parked right there, not at her mom's house. My stomach twisted into knots. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head, colliding with each other. Maybe she was visiting a friend. Maybe her mom had come into town and they decided to stay here. Maybe, but deep down I knew. The blinds on the apartment windows were drawn, but I didn't need to see inside. The truth was screaming at me from that parking lot. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, wasn't where she said she'd be. And the only reason she'd lie about something like that was because she was with someone else. I drove past slowly, my heart pounding, then turned the corner and pulled over half a block away. I just sat there in silence, the engine idling, staring at nothing. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't. Instead, I went home, poured myself a whiskey, and sat in the dark living room until well past midnight, trying to make sense of it. My mind kept replaying every moment we'd shared, searching for the signs I must have missed. The way she smiled at her phone sometimes, the sudden excuses to stay late at work, the weekends with her mom, it's all lined up too perfectly. And yet, even as the evidence stacked up in my mind, a part of me clung desperately to denial. I told myself I needed proof. I needed to hear it from her. Because until I did, there was still a sliver of hope that I was wrong. That I hadn't just witnessed the beginning of the end of my marriage, but that hope was fading fast. The morning after I saw her car outside that apartment, I woke up with the kind of headache that doesn't just come from whiskey. It was the kind of headache that comes from replaying the same thoughts until they scrape against each other like broken records. I barely slept an hour, maybe two, when the sun filtered through the blinds. I felt like a shell of myself. Emily came home around noon that Sunday, breezing in like nothing was out of the ordinary. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her shoes, and told me her mom had made cinnamon rolls that morning, like it was just another weekend. I watched her move around the kitchen, and the ease in her voice made me feel sick. She was either the best liar I'd ever known, or she had convinced herself that what she was doing wasn't wrong. I didn't say anything right away. I just nodded, asked her about her mom, pretended to listen. Inside, though, I was screaming. My mind was split in two, one half, begging me to confront her, to demand the truth, and the other terrified of what that truth might actually be. For the rest of that week, I lived in a fog. At work, I found myself staring at spreadsheets, unable to focus. My coworkers probably thought I was just stressed, maybe burned out. I laughed when I needed to laugh, nodded when people spoke to me, but inside I was consumed with suspicion. Every time Emily picked up her phone, every time she said she was going out, I felt my chest tighten. I kept trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. That was the hardest part. I wanted so badly to believe her, to believe that the life we had built wasn't a lie. But once doubt creeps in, it spreads like mold. It infects everything. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. On a Friday night, Emily told me she was going to stay at her mom's again. I remember her words so clearly, the way she said them casually while brushing her hair in the mirror. "Don't wait up for me." I'll probably be back Sunday evening. She smiled at me through the reflection, like everything was fine, like we were just two people in a normal marriage. And then she kissed my cheek and left. This time I couldn't just sit at home and wonder. I needed to know. I waited a couple of hours, pacing the living room, heart racing, palms sweating. Around 9 o'clock, I grabbed my keys and drove. Not to her mom's, but back to that apartment complex. It was a warm September night, the kind where the cicadas buzz so loud it feels like the whole world is humming. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, feeling like some kind of criminal. My legs were trembling, my mouth dry. When I reached the complex, I slowed my steps, scanning the lot, and there it was, her car. Same spot as before. Same dent, same sticker. My heart sank, and in that moment, all the denial drained out of me. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't misunderstanding. She was there and she wasn't with her mom. I stood there for a long time, staring at that car, trying to summon the courage to do something. Part of me wanted to march up to the apartment, pound on the door, and catch her in the act. But another part of me was paralyzed, terrified of what I'd actually see. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know, your life is never the same. I didn't go up. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a photo. Proof. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to remind me I wasn't imagining this. Enough to silence that voice in my head that still whispered, "Maybe you're wrong." I drove back home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, tears burning in my eyes. I hadn't cried like that in years, not since my father passed away in 2017. The grief felt eerily similar, a hollow ache in the chest, a sense of something irreplaceable slipping through my fingers. When Emily came home that Sunday evening, I was waiting for her. Not with accusations, not yet, but with silence. I couldn't bring myself to say the words. She walked in, kissed me like she always did, asked how my weekend was. I said it was fine. I asked about her mom. She launched into some story about gardening and baking. Details too specific to be entirely fabricated. And I just sat there nodding, while bile rose in my throat. That night, lying next to her in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how surreal it all felt. This woman I'd shared my life with, the one I thought I knew inside and out, was living a double life, and I was complicit in my silence. The following weekend it happened again. Another trip to her mom's, another bag packed, another casual kiss goodbye. This time, I followed her. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice me, my heart pounding with every turn of the wheel. She drove not toward her mom's town, but straight toward the apartment complex. When she pulled into the lot, I parked on a side street and watched as she got out of the car, and then I saw him, a man, tall dark hair, maybe mid-30s, walked out to meet her. He wrapped his arms around her like they'd done this 100 times before, and she melted into him. They kissed, right there in the open. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. My world shattered. I felt like the ground had opened beneath me. My ears rang, my vision blurred. I wanted to scream, to run up and rip them apart, to demand an explanation. But I couldn't move. I just sat there in my car, hidden in the shadows, watching the woman I loved betray me in the most brutal, undeniable way. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time lost all meaning. Eventually, I drove away, hands numb on the wheel, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch and stared into the dark. Images kept replaying in my head, her smile as she kissed him, the way she leaned into his chest. It was intimate, familiar. It wasn't just an affair, it was a relationship. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was living a second life. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Instead, I scrolled through old photos of us together. Birthdays, our wedding day. In one picture from 2019, we were at Niagara Falls, grinning at the camera with water spraying behind us. I looked at that version of us and wondered how we had gotten here. How could that smile, that joy, exist alongside the lies she was living now? The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep silent anymore. The weight of it was crushing me, and if I didn't confront her, I was going to break. I waited until that evening. She came home from work, humming to herself as she set her bag down. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the photo of her car outside his apartment pulled up on my phone. My hands were shaking, my throat tight. When she sat down across from me, I turned the phone toward her. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me, and in that instant, I saw the flicker of recognition, a split second of panic before she schooled her face into something neutral. She opened her mouth to say something. Maybe to lie, maybe to explain, but I cut her off. My voice cracked as I asked her where she really was that night. The silence that followed was suffocating. That was the breaking point. The moment when denial died. When the fragile scaffolding of our marriage collapsed under the weight of truth, and though she eventually started to talk, offering excuses and explanations that blurred together in a haze of anger and grief, nothing she said could erase what I'd seen with my own eyes. My life, as I had known it, was over. After that night at the kitchen table, nothing was ever the same. It's strange how quickly the world can shift on its axis. One moment, you're living in the reality you've always known, marriage, routines, shared jokes, plans for the future, and the next. It feels like someone has taken a sledgehammer to everything you thought was solid. When I showed Emily the photo of her car outside the apartment, she froze for a second, then tried to speak. At first, she denied it. She said I must have misunderstood that she was at her mom's, and maybe I was confused about when I'd seen her car. But lies like that don't last long when there's evidence staring back at you. Eventually, her shoulders slumped. She whispered something I'll never forget. I didn't mean for you to find out this way. It was confirmation. But it wasn't an explanation. We sat in silence for a long time after that. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside. I wanted to scream, to demand details, to throw something, anything, just to release the pressure building inside me. But all I could do was sit there, numb. As she stared down at her hands, when she finally spoke again, it was with that quiet, careful tone people use when they know they're walking through a minefield. She told me his name, Ryan, said he was someone she'd met through a mutual friend at a charity event. That it had just happened, like falling into bed with another man, was the kind of thing that slipped through the cracks of everyday life. She said she hadn't planned for it, that she never wanted to hurt me. She was confused about what she wanted. Confused. That word nearly broke me. Because confusion is forgetting what to eat for dinner, or not knowing which career move to make, not sneaking around. Behind your husband's back for months, the conversation dissolved quickly into shouting. I asked her how long it had been going on, and she admitted it started earlier that year, sometime around March. That was 6 months. 6 months of lies, of carefully constructed stories, of kissing me goodnight after spending time in another man's bed. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in on me, and I had to walk outside just to get air. It was a cool evening, but I was sweating, my whole body buzzing with adrenaline. I paced the backyard, fists clenched, while Emily stayed inside. That night, she slept in the guest room. I didn't sleep at all. I lay in our bed, my bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about every single moment we'd shared since March. Every dinner. Every weekend. Every time she told me she loved me. It all felt tainted. Poisoned. The fallout wasn't just emotionally, bled into every part of my life. At work, I was a disaster. My boss noticed immediately. In meetings, I'd drift off, staring at the conference room table as people talked around me. Deadlines slipped. I started leaving early or showing up late, using vague excuses about not feeling well. My coworkers stopped asking me to lunch because I'd just sit there, pushing food around my plate, barely contributing to the conversation. Friends noticed too. My buddy Mark invited me to watch the Ohio State game that weekend, like we always did, but I couldn't bring myself to go. I couldn't handle the noise, the laughter, the normalcy. I told him I was sick, but he knew something was off. He pressed me about it a few times, but I wasn't ready to talk. How do you even begin to explain that your marriage is falling apart because your wife is in love with someone else? Family was even harder. My mom called that week, asking how Emily and I were doing. I found myself lying, telling her everything was fine, that work was just stressful. I couldn't bring myself to shatter her image of us yet. She'd always adored Emily, always bragged about how lucky I was to have found someone so kind, so perfect. The thought of telling her the truth made me feel like a failure all over again. At home, things were unbearable. The air between Emily and me was heavy with unspoken words. Sometimes she'd try to talk, to explain herself, but I couldn't listen. Every word felt like salt in an open wound. Other times, we moved around the house like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when necessary. The life we had built together had shrunk to a series of awkward silences and forced small talk. I started drinking more. At first, it was just a beer after work, something to take the edge off. But soon, it was whiskey, poured heavy, 2 or 3 glasses a night. It dulled the pain, numbed the constant replay of images in my head, her with him, laughing, touching, kissing. But it also made the mornings worse, the hangovers mixing with the grief to create a haze that clung to me all day. One night, maybe a week after the confrontation, I found myself scrolling through her Instagram. I'd never been the type to snoop, but now I couldn't stop myself. Every photo felt like a puzzle piece, every caption a possible clue. I scrolled back to March, and sure enough, I started to see the subtle changes. The way her smiles looked different, brighter in some photos. The way she'd posted about girls' nights but never tagged anyone. The way she'd seemed more distant in the pictures of us together. Her body angled slightly away from mine. It felt like someone had gone back and rewritten our history while I wasn't looking. I thought about confronting Ryan. About showing up at his apartment and demanding answers. I even drove past his place once just to see it. A basic brick complex, nothing special. His car was parked out front, a black Ford Escape with a license plate frame from a local dealership. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the door, imagining what I'd say if he came out. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to step into that world to make it even more real than it already was. Instead, I turned inward. I stopped answering calls from friends. I skipped out on family dinners. I buried myself in the couch, scrolling endlessly through my phone, searching for something, anything that could distract me from the storm inside my head. But nothing worked. The pain was constant, gnawing at me from the inside. There were moments when I thought about leaving immediately, about packing a bag and walking out the door. But then I'd look around the house, at the photos on the walls, at the dog we'd adopted together 2 years earlier, and I'd freeze. This was my life. Our life. Walking away felt impossible, even as staying became unbearable. I kept replaying the good times in my head. It's like a cruel highlight reel. The New York trip, when I proposed. Our honeymoon in Asheville, hiking through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Christmas mornings spent sipping coffee in our pajamas, exchanging gifts we'd picked out with so much thought. Were those moments real? Or had I just been blind the whole time? Sleep became my enemy. I'd lie awake for hours, staring into the dark, my mind looping through questions I couldn't answer. Why wasn't I enough? What did he give her that I couldn't? Did she ever really love me, or had it all been an illusion? Sometimes I'd slip into restless dreams where I caught her again, only for her to vanish when I tried to reach for her. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, heart racing. There was one night, about 3 weeks after the confrontation, when I hit rock bottom. I was sitting on the floor of the living room, an empty whiskey bottle beside me, scrolling through old texts between Emily and me. I landed on a message from 2 years earlier, where she'd written, "I can't believe I get to spend forever with you. You're my everything." Stared at those words, until my vision blurred with tears. Forever. Everything. And then I laughed a bitter, broken laugh that echoed in the empty room. Because forever had turned into this. That was the night I realized I couldn't keep living in limbo. I had to do something, anything, to reclaim some sense of control. Because if I didn't, the fallout was going to destroy me completely. It took me a while to figure out what turning the tables even meant in a situation like this. There's no manual for discovering your spouse has been living a double life. There's no guide for how to take back control when your world has been stripped from under you. But after weeks of lying on the couch, drowning in whiskey and old memories, I realized that waiting, hoping, and wallowing wasn't going to solve anything. I needed action. The first step was understanding. I needed to know everything. Not just the obvious details like where she'd gone, who he was, but the emotional mechanics of it. Why had it happened? How had she justified it to herself? I needed the answers for my own sanity, and I had to start somewhere, so I started watching. Not in a creepy, obsessive way, well, maybe a little, but I started paying attention to her patterns. I knew she'd gone to that apartment multiple times, and if she was going to continue, I needed to be prepared. I began documenting everything: dates, times, excuses. I even tracked her movements subtly, noting when she left work, when she picked up coffee, who she called. It was methodical, almost clinical, and in a strange way. It gave me a sense of control that I'd been lacking. The next step was confronting myself. I had been crushed by grief, by anger, by betrayal, but I realized that while Emily's choices had hurt me, my own response could either destroy me or save me. I decided I wouldn't let her affair define the rest of my life. I couldn't control her, but I could control me. And that meant rebuilding, piece by piece. I started small. I reconnected with friends I'd pushed away. Mark, my longtime buddy, was the first to notice. I invited him over one Friday night. No excuses, no lies. We drank beer, watched the football game, and for the first time in weeks, I laughed without bitterness. Not a full laugh, not one that healed everything, but a start. I also started focusing on work. I had neglected deadlines and projects, letting my grief consume me. But I realized that immersing myself in something productive could act as therapy. I stayed late, organized tasks, even took on a few projects I hadn't before. Slowly, I began to reclaim a sense of competence, a feeling that I still had control over at least one part of my life. But the real turning point came when I decided I needed more than just observation. I needed proof. Not for revenge, not for humiliation, but for clarity. I needed to see the full picture for myself, to confront the reality without any doubt. I wasn't sure what I'd do with that proof. But the waiting, the uncertainty, was killing me. One Thursday evening, Emily told me she had to go out for work drinks. She gave me the vague smile, the kind that used to make me feel warm but now just set my stomach twisting. I pretended to be fine, and when she left, I got in my car and followed her. Not close enough to be obvious, but close enough to know her route. She didn't go to a bar. She went to the apartment complex. My heart sank, but I stayed calm. I had a plan this time. I parked a few streets over, just as I had done before. Then, instead of sitting and panicking, I walked slowly around the block, observing. The apartment lights flicked on, and I saw him, Ryan, opening the door. He was laughing at something she said, gesturing with his hands, the way people do when they're comfortable and familiar. Emily leaned into him. I felt the old surge of anger, but this time I didn't flee or freeze. I watched quietly, taking mental notes, observing everything. And then I made a decision. I wasn't going to act out of blind rage. I was going to reclaim my life first, emotionally and mentally, and then decide what the next step would be. Over the next month, I started making changes that surprised even me. I started running again, something I hadn't done consistently since college. The early morning runs became my meditation, a way to work out the tension and anger and grief before it could consume me. I noticed small shifts. My posture improved, my breathing steadied, my mind began to feel sharper. Physical strength helped me feel a little emotional strength. Like my body was reminding my mind that I still mattered, that I still existed beyond this betrayal. I also began seeing a therapist, something I had scoffed at in the past. At first, it felt awkward to talk to a stranger about such personal pain, but slowly, the sessions became a lifeline. We discussed everything: my sense of betrayal, my fears, my self-doubt, even my anger toward Emily. The therapist didn't tell me what to do, but she guided me toward understanding, toward taking responsibility for my healing rather than waiting for Emily to fix anything. Meanwhile, Emily's behavior shifted too. She started noticing my distance, my quiet resolve, and it unnerved her. She tried to engage, to charm, to explain, but I stayed calm, measured. I didn't attack. I didn't plead. I just listened, watched, and held on to my newfound sense of control. There were nights when she confronted me, asking why I seemed different, why I wasn't reacting like before. I told her I needed space, that I was processing. She didn't like it, but she couldn't argue. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of power not over her, but over myself. I was no longer a passive victim of her actions. Then came the moment when I finally decided it was time to confront the full truth. I couldn't go back in time or undo what had happened, but I could confront her and Ryan together. Not to start a fight, but to see them in the open. To know exactly what I was dealing with. One Friday night, I texted Emily, telling her I wanted to talk. She looked at me, suspicious, but agreed. I didn't tell her it would be at Ryan's apartment, just that we needed to clear the air. I drove there with a mix of fear and adrenaline, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was a lifeline. When I reached the complex, I waited a few minutes before knocking on the door. Ryan answered, surprised, but he recognized me from the neighborhood occasionally. He worked nearby. We'd seen each other at a coffee shop once. Emily froze behind him, caught in the tension. I walked in, calm, measured. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply stood there, looking at both of them, letting the weight of my presence fill the room. The silence was deafening. I could see the guilt flicker across Emily's face, the awkwardness in Ryan's posture. I didn't speak for a moment, and then I said what I had rehearsed 100 times in my head. I need to know the truth. Everything. No more lies. What followed was a cascade of admissions, apologies, and awkward justifications. Emily tried to explain, but I was beyond anger. I was past the point of trying to plead. I listened, taking in every word, every hesitation, every detail. And when they were done, I realized something important. I was no longer the desperate, broken man I had been. I was a witness to the truth, yes. But I was also standing on my own 2 feet. That night I left their apartment with clarity. I wasn't going to get back with Emily, not now. Maybe not ever. But I was also no longer crushed by uncertainty. I had faced the betrayal, seen it in full, and I had survived. More than survived, I was beginning to thrive. The next few weeks were about rebuilding. I changed my routines, refocused on work, and leaned on my friends and therapists for support. I started small projects at home, fixing the backyard fence, reorganizing the garage, even repainting the guest room. Every small accomplishment reminded me that my life could continue even without her. By the time October rolled around, I had a sense of inner strength I hadn't known before. Emily and I spoke occasionally about logistics bills, shared responsibilities, but our conversations were practical, devoid of emotional manipulation. She moved out of our house by mid-October, taking her things and leaving me the space to heal. And finally, I allowed myself to feel. Not just anger or sadness, but also relief, freedom, and the quiet confidence that comes from reclaiming control over your own life. I wasn't the same man I had been in March. I was stronger, more aware, and most importantly, I was no longer a victim. The months after Emily left were a strange mix of emptiness and freedom. The house felt quieter without her presence, but not in a comforting way at first. Every room, every corner, every photo reminded me of what had been lost. Yet gradually, as I unpacked the last of her things and reorganized the house, I began to see it as my space again, sanctuary instead of a prison of memories. I threw myself into work and personal growth like never before. I finally took the promotion I had been putting off at the healthcare company. Something I had hesitated to pursue out of habit, comfort, and, I admit, fear. For years I had stayed in a safe routine, letting life roll by while I clung to predictability. Losing Emily had forced me out of that comfort zone. I embraced challenges, learned new skills, even started mentoring younger colleagues, which reminded me that there was value in my life beyond heartbreak. I also rebuilt my social life. Mark was my rock through everything. He and his wife invited me to dinner frequently, sometimes just to distract me, sometimes to remind me that I could still belong somewhere. Slowly, I reached out to other friends I had neglected, college buddies, neighbors, even a few old coworkers. Socializing didn't erase the pain, but it reminded me that the world hadn't ended, that my life was not defined solely by Emily's betrayal. I started dating again too, cautiously at first. The first date after the separation was nerve-wracking. I sat across from a woman named Claire at a small Italian bistro, nervously twisting my fork. I expected to feel anxious, panicked, maybe even paralyzed by the thought of trust and vulnerability, but I didn't. I felt ready. It was a small, tentative step, but it was mine. I'll admit, there were setbacks. There were nights I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, suddenly remembering the image of Emily in Ryan's apartment. There were moments of anger, fleeting thoughts of revenge that my therapist assured me were normal. But I learned to process them, not act on them. I stopped letting them control me. One evening, about 6 months after she left, I drove past that apartment complex one last time. Her car was gone. The place looked quiet, normal. I didn't feel the surge of rage I had expected. Instead, I felt a strange kind of closure. The apartment wasn't a symbol of betrayal anymore, it was just a building. The power it once held over me was gone. I realized I didn't need her validation, her presence, or even her explanation to reclaim my life. By winter, I had transformed my routine into something almost meditative. I would wake early, go for a run in the crisp morning air, come back, make coffee, and sit on the porch watching the world wake up. I read books I had put off for years, learned some photography, and even volunteered at a local animal shelter. These small, meaningful things filled my days with purpose and reminded me that life could still be beautiful. Even after heartbreak, family holidays were still hard at first. Emily had been part of so many traditions: Christmas decorating, Thanksgiving cooking, birthdays, and anniversaries. But I found that creating new routines helped me reclaim these days. I started small. I hosted a friends-only Thanksgiving, where laughter and stories replaced the ghosts of the past. I traveled to Cleveland for Christmas with my parents, where the focus shifted from what I had lost to what I still had, emotionally. I began to forgive not Emily, not Ryan, but myself. I forgave myself for being naive, for trusting, for allowing someone else's choices to dictate my self-worth. I realized that betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. And in forgiving myself, I found the strength to move forward, rather than linger in anger or regret. One of the most profound changes was in how I approached relationships. I learned to set boundaries, to communicate openly, and, most importantly, to trust my instincts. Trust became a choice, not a given. I stopped seeing love as something that could only exist through attachment or routine, and started seeing it as something that could thrive alongside self-respect and awareness. By spring, I was ready to embrace something new. Claire had become more than just a first-date experiment. She was patient, understanding, and had her own scars from life. We didn't rush anything. We went on hikes, explored local festivals, tried new restaurants, and talked for hours about our pasts, our mistakes, and our hopes for the future. For the first time in a long while, I felt the flutter of excitement that comes with being truly alive. Not just surviving, reflecting back on everything that had happened. I realized that betrayal had given me a strange kind of gift. It had stripped away complacency, forced me to confront my deepest fears, and pushed me into personal growth I might never have pursued otherwise. Pain had been the catalyst, but I had chosen how to respond. I had chosen strength over despair, healing over bitterness. I also learned the importance of control. Not control over others, but over myself. Over my reactions, my emotions, my choices. That lesson became the foundation for every decision I made afterward. I was no longer reactive. I was deliberate. I didn't need validation from Emily, Ryan, or anyone else to feel whole. I discovered that power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering your own life. And then came the moment I knew I had truly moved on. One Saturday morning, I woke up early, brewed my coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the sunrise over the Ohio horizon. The air smelled like spring, fresh with dew and new beginnings. I felt a calm I hadn't felt since before all of this started. I wasn't angry. I wasn't obsessing. I wasn't drowning in memories. I was simply here, alive, aware, and unbroken. I thought about Emily one last time, not with hatred, not with longing, but with a sense of finality. We had shared a life, yes, but that chapter had ended. I had turned the tables not by destroying her or seeking revenge, but by reclaiming myself. My happiness no longer depended on someone else's honesty or love. It depended on me. A few months later, I moved into a smaller, cozier apartment downtown. It was a fresh start, full of light and open space. I decorated it the way I liked, not worrying about anyone else's taste or preferences. I felt grounded, unburdened, and strangely free. Claire and I continued building our connection, slowly, deliberately. There was no rush, no pressure, no fear of betrayal. I had learned from the past, and I carried those lessons forward. Our relationship wasn't about filling a void. It was about sharing life with someone who respected my boundaries, appreciated my growth, and wanted to be there for the right reasons. And though the memory of Emily and Ryan would always exist a scar, shadow, I no longer let it define me. I had faced the breaking point, survived the fallout, and rebuilt myself stronger than before. Betrayal had been the catalyst, but healing, growth, and self-respect became the reward. Looking back now, almost a year later, I see it all with clarity. The grief, the anger, the sleepless nights, they were necessary, painful as they were. They forced me to confront reality, to stop relying on illusions, and to reclaim my life from the chaos that had threatened to consume it. I don't know if Emily and Ryan's relationship lasted. I never asked. And I don't care, because my life is mine, and that is a truth I will never let go of again. I've learned that love can be cruel, but resilience, honesty, and self-respect are infinitely more powerful. And most importantly, I've learned that even in the darkest moments, when betrayal cuts deep and the world seems to crumble around you, it's possible to rise. Not just survive, but to thrive, to grow, and to rediscover the joy, freedom, and beauty that life still has to offer. So if you're listening or reading this, and you felt the sting of betrayal, the ache of loss, or the despair of someone else's choices ripping through your life, know this: it doesn't define you. You are not powerless. You can take control, rebuild, and find a version of yourself stronger than you ever imagined. Because the ending isn't about revenge, or tears or shattered dreams. It's about survival, strength, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are enough. And for me, that was the most unforgettable ending of all.